In the spring of 1919, the victors of World War I gather at the Palace of Versailles near Paris. 4 years of war have left Europe devastated. 4 years of destruction, death, and exhaustion. Now, the winners want to decide the future, and that includes Germany. Above all, France pushes for a tough solution. Never again, they say, should war be launched from German soil. The treaty that will weaken Germany and hold it accountable for the war is crafted over months, with no German involvement, behind closed doors, solely by the victors. It's only at the signing that the German delegation is invited, or rather, summoned, to Versailles. The location is no accident. The Hall of Mirrors in the palace, where in 1871 the German Empire was proclaimed. A symbolic place and a show of power. On June 28, 1919, Germany's Foreign Minister Hermann Müller and Minister of Transport Johannes Bell signed the treaty, under protest. They had no choice. What follows is more than just a diplomatic defeat. It's a humiliation. Germany not only has to give up large parts of its territory, Alsace-Lorraine in the west, Poznan and West Prussia in the east, but also all of its colonies. In addition, full disarmament, no tanks, no air force, no submarines, only an army of 100,000 men, and reparations of unimaginable proportions, entire trains full of raw materials, industrial equipment, and goods leave the country. The economic backbone is deliberately weakened. But perhaps the heaviest blow comes from the so-called War Guilt Clause. It declares Germany as the sole cause of the World War. For many Germans, this is an outrageous accusation, and the treaty as a whole feels like a forced piece of shame. How could Germany, despite all these restrictions and the immense reparations burden, rearm so quickly? How did a defeated and disarmed state manage, within just a few years, to become a military power that would plunge the world into another war just 20 years later? After the forced peace of Versailles, only a shadow of the once mighty German army remained. The Reichswehr, a small army of just 100,000 men, without heavy weapons, conscription, or a general staff. From now on, Germany was only supposed to defend itself. For the Germans, this was an unbearable situation. General Hans von Seeckt, head of the Army Command, had a clear plan. The Reichswehr wasn't just meant to survive, it was meant to be the foundation for a future new army. Officially small and weak, but unofficially highly modern, well organized, and ready to expand at any time. The Reichswehr became a training ground for future leaders. Every soldier was carefully selected, many from conservative monarchist circles. It wasn't just about training soldiers, it was about shaping multipliers. Because if war were to come again, every man had to be able to lead a company. At the same time, paramilitary groups were emerging all over the country. Many of these groups had originated from the chaotic post-war years when the state had been forced to rely on Freikorps to suppress uprisings. These Freikorps, former frontline soldiers united by discipline, hatred of the treaty, and the new system, operated like military units, but were not officially part of the army. One particularly important player in this network was the Stahlhelm League of Front Soldiers. Founded in 1918, it was officially a veterans association, but it soon became a mass organization with a military character. Men in uniform marched, held roll calls, trained, and were ready. What started as a Veterans Honor League became a disciplined shadow army. By the late 1920s, the Stahlhelm had around 500,000 members, but the state organs weren't unaffected either. Particularly the newly formed Schutzpolizei, responsible for public order, quickly turned into a covert military reserve. Their training was almost identical to that of the Reichswehr. Handling weapons, drill, terrain tactics. The lines between policeman and soldier became deliberately blurred. Many policemen had already served in the war and were physically and mentally battle-tested. The Reichswehr saw them as a quiet reinforcement for the worst-case scenario. Even more secret was the Black Reichswehr, unofficial, illegal troops training in hidden camps and decommissioned barracks. Their members were not on any lists, their numbers were not reported, and their existence was officially denied. They operated in the shadows and were ready to use violence, not only against external enemies, but also against political opponents within. One notorious example was the so-called Feme murders, where traitors or unwanted witnesses were secretly eliminated. Meanwhile, abroad, the next generation of soldiers was being trained. In the Soviet Union, a country that, like Germany, had been sidelined from the international order after the First World War, an unlikely partnership emerged. In 1922, through the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and Soviet Russia restored diplomatic ties and secretly agreed to military cooperation. Building on this agreement, 3 hidden training sites were established over the following years. At Lipetsk, from 1925, German pilots received advanced training in aerial combat. At Kama, starting in 1926, German officers developed and tested new strategies for armored warfare. And at Tomka, near Volsk, from 1928 onward, German and Soviet specialists worked jointly on the development and testing of chemical weapons, all far from any international oversight. Parallel to this, Germany also fostered unofficial military contacts with the United States. Although no formal training took place on American soil, numerous Reichswehr officers, including senior commanders, traveled to the U.S. on study missions. They closely observed the latest developments in tank warfare, artillery, chemical warfare, aviation, and military logistics. The insights gained from these connections would later prove invaluable for Germany's rearmament efforts beyond the constraints of Versailles. It's estimated that between 1919 and 1933, around 300,000 to 400,000 men were covertly trained militarily in Germany, far more than the officially allowed 100,000. The Reichswehr itself wasn't a rigid structure, but a multiplying system that systematically trained, rotated, and reinforced its personnel. Stop. If this story kept you watching, the way creating it kept us digging, then help keep it from being forgotten. A like or a subscription shows that these topics still have a place and helps us keep making more. Thanks for your support. Now, let's continue. While soldiers were secretly being trained, behind the scenes, a well-disguised program was also running within the German economy: the creation of a covert arms industry. Industry, military leadership, and politics often worked hand in hand, united in the goal of circumventing the disarmament provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had clear rules, but instead of complying, major German companies started finding new ways to work around these restrictions. In secret, far from the control of the victorious powers, the German industry began collaborating closely with international partners. These partnerships were disguised as legal businesses, but in reality, they served a much larger plan: the covert rearmament. One name stands out in particular: Krupp. The traditional arms manufacturer from Essen had already been the backbone of German weapon production during the Empire, and it continued to operate after the war. Officially, Krupp made agricultural equipment and locomotives, but in reality, they were researching modern artillery, tank parts, and weapon technology. Entire production lines were hidden or moved abroad. Similarly, the Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel, which officially no longer built warships, continued to secretly develop submarines. These were often created in parts, stored abroad, and later, after the Nazis came to power, brought back for mass production. Then there was Rheinmetall. According to the treaty, it could hardly produce military goods anymore, but it quickly set up subsidiaries abroad, in places like Switzerland and the Netherlands. Through these companies, development continued, weapons were tested, and prototypes were built, things that were banned in Germany. What was created there could easily be brought back and mass-produced when needed. The company Junkers, known for its aircraft, also skillfully bypassed the restrictions. In Dessau, they developed civilian aircraft, but at the same time, they were researching military aviation technology. Through a secret partnership with the Soviet Union, they created the aforementioned Air Force School in Lipetsk, where Junkers planes were tested for military use. A key part of this strategy was moving research and production abroad to get around the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. The Netherlands became one of the main locations, where companies like Fokker, known for its civilian aircraft, worked closely with German engineers. Military aircraft models were developed here that would later be used by the German Air Force. These collaborations were kept mostly secret because the League of Nations couldn't monitor military activities on Dutch soil. The Netherlands wasn't just important for aviation. German companies also found refuge there in the submarine industry. As early as the 1920s, German engineers began building submarines in The Hague and Rotterdam. These were officially disguised as civilian ships to evade the strict provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. In reality, they were state-of-the-art submarines that would later be used by the Kriegsmarine. Krupp was a major player here as well. Through Sweden, important military technologies flowed into German tank and artillery development. This cooperation primarily focused on weapons production and technology. Connections with Spain and Turkey were also crucial for the buildup of Germany's military capacity. In Spain, during the Civil War, German weapons were tested on a large scale, with German engineers working closely with the nationalists. These real-world tests allowed new weapons and tactics to be trialed against a militarily inexperienced enemy. In Turkey, German advisors worked with the Turkish armed forces, not only sharing technology, but also organizing the training of officers and combat troops. Germany benefited from training military personnel, who would later act as multipliers of German wartime strategies. All these secret projects were made possible by a carefully coordinated financial strategy, which allowed Germany to continue rearming despite the crushing reparations payments from the Treaty of Versailles and the economic crisis after World War I. A key factor in this financing was the role of American banks and investors like J.P. Morgan and Company, Dillon Read and Company, and the National City Bank. In the 1920s, significant loans from the U.S. flowed into Germany, especially through the Dawes Plan, which was passed in 1924. This plan allowed Germany to restructure its reparations payments and defer some of its obligations. As a result, German companies, particularly in the arms industry, gained access to vital financial resources. Under these conditions, German companies involved in rearmament were able to take out loans in partnership with international banks to fund secret projects. The connections between German and foreign companies were often opaque, often handled through intermediaries or subsidiaries to bypass international regulations. These financial connections between Germany, foreign banks, and companies were crucial to the rearmament process and formed a shadow market in which the rebuilding of Germany's war machinery took place out of sight of the victorious powers.
Mr. Ritter, I thank you very much for the kind words you have addressed to me, and especially for what you said to me on behalf of Mayor O'Brien. As you say, I have been here rather often, since 1905. And as you may remember, my parents were married in the city of New York, where my father used to become an American citizen. My elder brother has been born in New York, so I feel almost half of a New Yorker. Please will you give my best regards and thanks to Mayor O'Brien and tell him that I am so grateful for the kind reception and welcome he has offered to me. When I come back from Washington, I hope to pay my respects to him and see him before I leave. You will understand that I first have to go to Washington because the German government has been invited to send her envoy there, and it is a great pleasure for us to discuss the matters for the International Economic Conference with your eminent president, for whom we have the greatest admiration in our country.
When Hitler came to power in 1933, it marked not only a political shift, but also a fundamental change in Germany's military course. The secret rearmament programs that had begun under the Weimar Republic, with the help of international partners, now reached their peak. A public and systematic military buildup that openly violated the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, who saw military strength as the foundation of his expansion plans, immediately pushed for the rapid rearmament of Germany. Unlike the secret efforts during the Weimar years, driven primarily by figures like General von Zicht, rearmament under Hitler became a public, state-led project, supported by mass propaganda. Building military strength was no longer a covert operation, but an official national goal. On March 16, 1935, Hitler publicly announced the return of compulsory military service, an open violation of the Treaty of Versailles. 2 months later, on May 21st, the Reichswehr was officially renamed Wehrmacht, and a new military law laid the foundation for the massive rearmament that followed. By the end of 1935, troop strength had grown from 100,000 to over 500,000 soldiers. At the same time, cooperation with the armaments industry became open and direct. Many German companies received large state contracts and quickly restructured for war production. Companies like Mauser, Henschel, MAN, Messerschmitt, Junkers, Blohm and Voss, BMW, VW, Siemens, Thyssen, and AEG began producing directly for the Wehrmacht. International firms such as Ford and General Motors via Opel and even IBM were also involved. The production of rifles, tanks, aircraft, warships, communication systems, and ammunition increased significantly. Large corporations like IG Farben, Krupp, and Rheinmetall became key pillars of the German war economy. These developments triggered mixed reactions among the Allies. France, most concerned about German rearmament, responded with alarm. But in Britain and Italy, the reaction was more cautious. Although they condemned the treaty violations, there were no military countermeasures at this stage. With the return of conscription, the Luftwaffe began training pilots and developing combat aircraft in 1935 under the command of Hermann Göring. At the same time, the Kriegsmarine under Admiral Erich Raeder was secretly producing submarines and battleships. All of this clearly violated the Treaty of Versailles and signaled that Hitler was willing to break with the post-war order. The most blatant violation came on March 7, 1936, when Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to march into the Rhineland. This move directly breached both the Versailles Treaty and the Locarno Pact, which had designated the region as a demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France. A military advance here could have led to serious conflict, but Hitler relied on the hesitation of the Western powers. France was politically unstable, and Britain had little interest in further escalation. Italy, already moving closer to Germany, gave indirect support. As a result, Hitler was able to occupy the Rhineland without resistance. The Allied response was limited to protests and diplomatic sanctions. There was no military reaction. With the return of conscription, the rebuilding of the Luftwaffe, and the occupation of the Rhineland, the path for Germany's expansion was laid. Not only had the military infrastructure been rebuilt, but confidence in the strength of the Wehrmacht had also been restored. After remilitarizing the Rhineland, Hitler had openly violated the Treaty of Versailles, without consequences. But that was only the beginning. The next step went far beyond symbolism. It brought Germany soldiers, weapons, and industrial power. Through territorial expansion. On March 12, 1938, German troops marched into Austria. The so-called Anschluss met no resistance, On the contrary, it was widely welcomed. Just one day later, Austria was officially annexed into the German Reich. For Hitler's military ambitions, this meant tens of thousands of new soldiers, a highly modern arms industry, especially the Steyr works, as well as weapons, vehicles, and valuable raw materials. Even the gold reserves of the Austrian National Bank were transferred into German hands. But that wasn't the end. In March 1939, Hitler occupied the remaining parts of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and Moravia. What looked like another territorial gain on the map was in fact an industrial breakthrough for the German war machine. The occupation came just months after the Munich Agreement, in which Britain and France had forced the Czechoslovak government to cede the Sudetenland to Hitler, without military resistance and without Czech participation in the negotiations. When German troops marched into Prague, no one stopped them. The country was home to some of the most advanced arms factories in Europe: Škoda in Pilsen, Čecha Praga, Tatra, Zbrojovka, Brno. These factories now produced directly for the Wehrmacht tanks, artillery, ammunition, and vehicles. Fully equipped weapons, depots, and modern equipment of the Czech army also fell into German hands. By 1939, Germany had transformed into a massive military power. Around 4.5 million men were under arms. About 3.25 million served in the army, which had grown to over 100 divisions. The Luftwaffe counted roughly 400,000 men, and the Navy around 50,000. On top of that, up to 300,000 were part of the SS, other paramilitary groups, and reserve units. The German military had around 2,700 tanks, 30,000 artillery pieces, approximately 4,000 operational aircraft, and a fleet of about 33 warships and 57 submarines. Then, in the early hours of September 1st, 1939, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland, following a staged attack at the German radio station Gleiwitz, orchestrated by the SS.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
World War II had begun.